Archaeological world and the biblical world, and we're glad to have Dr. David May back. If you didn't meet him last week, he's professor of New Testament at Central Baptist Seminary, and we are the co-leaders of many trips to Israel and the Holy Land, and hope to do that again. And as I mentioned last week, he's also my best friend, and so it's always fun to host him. So please welcome Dr. David May.
Well, thanks. It's good to be back with you all. It is always fun to be here at Country Club and be able to share some time with my best friend. And so we got to have a little supper tonight and talk. So it's always great to be able to do that. As I mentioned last week, this week I want us to look at some archaeological discoveries and then the issue of looting, which is a big issue. So a lot of things to get through. Let's see if I can get through all of those this evening. Let's see. Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes, amazing what has been discovered. Jesus' sandals have been found. And if you put these on your feet, it will cure whatever you have ailing you. We all need to get in these sandals. Well, as you know, sensationalism, it sells. It sells. And especially when it comes to archaeological, quote, discoveries. Or how about this one? Has Noah's Ark been found on Turkish mountaintop? Now, perhaps the quality is related to the medium who is distributing this information. Fox News is distributing this. And at least they framed it as a question and not as Noah's Ark has been found on Turkish mountain. But they have a picture there to prove here is a person who is inside the ark walking around. Well, one of the things that always captures us, I think, so much are these headlines. And as you notice, this is Fox News. The other one was Weekly News, kind of a sensationalized journal. But sometimes even well-known papers put out headlines that pull you in. The Boston Globe, this is directly from one of their articles a few years back, says last week's bombshell, which was the release of the Gospel of Judas, had many Christians wondering where the familiar story of Good Friday needed some updating. Ooh, all that does is stir people up. National Geographic, the discovery threatens 2 millennium of Christian doctrine. That's even going to get more people clicking on websites and talking. So here's a few things I would suggest about approaching archaeological discoveries. You're always going to have to do it with a grain of salt. Headlines that claim greatest discovery ever, incredible once-in-a-lifetime discovery, bombshell, truth revealed, could change history, they don't pass what I call the smell test. They're too sensationalized to really give you perhaps good information. Another thing about evaluating these archaeological discoveries that are being in the news, who's the expert? Who is the individual that is putting this information out? Last week, I mentioned the Israeli Antiquities Authority. There is a credible source. They often have press releases that go out about archaeological discoveries that have happened in Israel. The latest one, which was about a week ago, was, and you may have seen it in the news, there was a Crusader Sword. Did you see that they found in the harbor there in the northern part of Israel, covered and encrusted with shells and snails and all kinds of things there. But evidently, some poor crusader around the year 900 kind of like we let our iPhones accidentally drop into the lake. He let his sword fall into the bay there. I can only imagine the look on his face when it went down. But who is the expert? Who is this Dr. Ziggurat? Because they will often put names associated with some of these articles. You can look them up and see if they have credibility or not. The briefer the information, I always find I'm a little bit more suspicious. Because if it is an important archaeological discovery, you're going to see that it has widespread and in-depth kind of coverage. So I'm always a bit suspicious whenever it is related to something very brief, very, very short. And then, of course, is money involved. Money involved. This is very true for many archaeological discoveries today because they are putting them on Discovery channels. National Geographic is often paying to have some of these things promoted. So is money involved in the process? Is somebody exhibiting particular artifacts because of their origin or what they claim to be? Well, is money involved in that process? And finally, as for anything, is it too good to be true? That to me is kind of ultimately the way I think about looking at some of these archaeological discoveries. Is it too good to be true? But these are the kinds of things that you would do for anything that you hear in the news. But sometimes we don't often do it when it comes to archaeological discoveries. We kind of go, oh gosh, this is going to change everything. Wow, I can't believe this is out there. Well, let's look at some of these discoveries. First of all, let me deal with archaeological discoveries that are fake, that captures people's attention. Typically, archaeological discoveries that make the most press and get sensationalized the most are those that come about in relationship to Jesus. So an archaeological discovery, if it can be connected or hooked to Jesus, is always going to get more press. And this is one that got a lot of press. That is, here was a ossuary. And what you're seeing here on the screen, this is a bone box. An ossuary is a bone box. The way that the people in the first century, Judeans, would bury the dead, you would actually have two burials. Your first burial, you would be placed in the tomb. They would wait a year till all of the flesh and the muscles are gone and you're nothing but bones. Then they would take your bones and they would put you in this bone box. And there were often more than one person in a bone box because often it was shared among the family. For example, this particular bone box here, there were a total of about 6 people or 6 bones that were found in that. And there's another one I'll show you also that had multiple. So you often find more bones than typically here. But this particular discovery was made around the year 2002. The Discovery Channel covered it along with Biblical Archaeology Society, which is a popularized archaeological society. But this particular discovery, we don't know where it actually came from because it was in private hands. That's the difference between an archaeological discovery that comes from an excavation that is authorized versus someone who is a private individual who has purchased it. What makes this one so interesting is the inscription. And there you see it. It translates as James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. This would have been the first archaeological evidence, tangible evidence that would have demonstrated the historical Jesus. Now, we've got...
What is the language?
The language here is Aramaic. Okay? And so here's part of the problem with the language. So go back to this language here. It's inscribed upon this ossuary, and there's no question that the ossuary is old. Is the inscription. That's the question.
Somebody on the thing is asking, are you sharing your screen?
I am, maybe I'm not. Am I sharing it now?
Got it up on here, but I don't know if they got it. Did we ever go to share screen or do you know?
I don't know. I'm sharing now, but guess what I'm having problems with? Oh. Can they see it now?
Yeah, sure.
See it now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I apologize. I think the recorded section, if you could probably go back and pick up that recorded section. You weren't able to see those first few slides. But this is a slide of, as I mentioned, the ossuary. This was an incredible kind of explosion that came out when it was put out there. In fact, this picture you're seeing right now was taken at the Royal Ontario Museum that displayed this. And this was displayed in 2002 in Toronto. In fact, Mike and I went, you were there that year, weren't you? Mike and I went to see this. Not only did we go and see this, everybody at the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion, which were meeting, that's 10,000 scholars combined, were meeting in Toronto in November. They brought this up here to the museum. Everybody rushed to see it. You would have thought a rock star was on display. I remember crowding around this and everyone going, oh my gosh, can you believe this? Can you believe this? I mean, at this time, it had only been announced in October. This was displayed in November. So questions hadn't been quite raised yet. But the Discovery Channel is the one who made the announcement. Now, typically, that should raise questions because that's not an authoritative source. If you watched anything else on the Discovery Channel, sometimes that's not an authoritative source. Once we got into looking at this particular inscription, as they brought in the Aramaic experts, they brought in the people who were looking at the patina and how it had been written, it becomes pretty clear that this is a fake. But it's a good fake because it's on a first century ossuary, so it makes it a little more difficult. The person who actually owned this in private life, he was brought up on a court case, and it took 7 years to go through the Israeli courts, and he was eventually found guilty of misdealing with antiquities. Now, they didn't rule all the authenticity of it. Rather, they let the experts deal with that. But this is just an example of one of the fakes that gets out there that makes big news. Second example, archaeological fake. The Gospel of Jesus' wife. Maybe you've heard this when it came out. There was a papyrus, as you see here on screen, that came out. Oh, you don't see it?
Nope. And now it's gone back to the problem we had earlier.
Okay. Sure.
This must be a fake PowerPoint. I don't understand.
No, let me try something.
It's not good.
I know, it's moving on my screen here, but it's not moving on the screen there.
I remember doing that before.
Who's there?
Yes.
Got it?
Yes.
All right, got it. What you see on the screen is this papyrus that has this particular translation on. And I've highlighted in bold here what made such an incredible kind of claim. Jesus said to them, his disciples, "My wife." This would be the first, not just the first archaeological discovery that ties Jesus to the historical Jesus, but also that Jesus was married. Well, this was presented by an extremely well-known scholar out of Harvard at an international meeting. So this wasn't done by Discovery Channel or anything like that. This is done by a well-respected individual who was duped because this is fake. If you want to read about it, can you see it up there? All right. This is one of the most fascinating books you'll read about a Harvard professor, a con man, and the gospel of Jesus' wife. This is one of the most thoroughly debunked fakes that has been done. This person did an incredible job. So if you're interested in it, you can follow up on this and read this. So there are fakes that are out there. The second thing when it comes to archaeological discoveries, and that is simply the misinterpretations and misrepresentations. So some archaeological discoveries are authentic, and this is one. If you notice on the right-hand side, this is the unconserved section from the Herculaneum, the city that was covered by Mount Vesuvius when it exploded. This is part of the remains that went unearthed. Well, if you see on the back wall there, looks like a cross, doesn't it? So when this was first discovered, they said, "We have discovered an early Christian meeting house." Because look, they had a cross. And it was for several years. This is the way they thought it was, and their interpretation. Misinterpretation. What that was is actually a bracket that was on the wall holding a cabinet. So you can see where you could have an authentic kind of discovery, but you misinterpret because you're bringing your own presuppositions to it. You go out finding what you're wanting to find. Yes?
I'd like your opinion or your thoughts on the rather large industry that the Mormon Church has put together to take Mesoamerican findings and push back and say, "Oh, these are the Nephites down in Yucatan." Our interpretation is that this proves Mormon theology.
Yes. That's a good question. That is, for example, when Mormons take particular archaeological discoveries here in this country and say, "This proves basically our theological." That is, again, one's presupposition, one's theology determining
on to the evidence.
It determines the outcome and the results. Exactly. This is why you have to be very careful about any kind of interpretation placed upon any object found, because those objects do not speak to us. We bring our own interpretation to them. And certainly when you have a great deal invested theologically in a perspective, you want to prove it. You want to believe it. And that's what happens. Well, there are some significant archaeological discoveries that are authentic and important for the New Testament. So let me just share a couple of these. There are the discovery of individuals mentioned in the New Testament. So outside of the New Testament, we can find archaeological remains that mention people in the New Testament. This is one, Pontius Pilate. Here is what the original would have looked like, and you can see there's just a little bit left on it left on it today. But this was discovered at the place called Caesarea by the sea, one of the harbors there that was used in Israel in the first century. And we have Pilate's name here. So we have tangible evidence of a historical person. And it looks like this would have been a dedication of a temple that was in Caesarea. And Pontius Pilate is mentioned here as the prefect of the governor here of Judea. Tangible evidence. Another individual that's mentioned in the New Testament. This is another ossuary, and this is the ossuary that actually had inside of it, there were 2 babies, an adult child, a teenager, an adult woman, and a 60-year-old man. So there were six people, bones that were thrown into here. This particular ossuary has on the outside the name Caiaphas. So this definitely goes back to the priesthood of the first century. There's nothing that suggests in this inscription that it was a fake. In fact, they found this when they weren't exactly excavating when they found this. When they found this, they had bulldozer doing construction. And this is often in Israel the way you discover things. Bulldozers doing construction work, it takes the top of a tomb off. And down in the tomb were several of these ossuaries. This was just one of them. So we know it's not been tampered with. We know where it came from. So it hasn't been in private hands. So the authenticity of this Caiaphas is pretty certain.
The writing of the name seems a bit crude, unless I just don't know letters well enough, compared to how precise the carving on the side is.
Yes. What you see on the carving on the front, these are sometimes referred to as these rosettes, very detailed, very ornate. That's a very specialized kind of carving that is done. Sometimes inscriptions and names like this, they do not do the same kind of fancy scripting. It's usually done afterwards. So it's not done at the same time as the carving. But the letters and writing in this day and age and inscriptions like this, sometimes they do look a bit crude because writing at this time is not as fancy as sometimes we think it is. But there's nothing they suggest in this, at least the people who have read through this, that would say that this is the way it came. But I agree with you. It's a bit crude looking versus the ossuary itself. And probably was a later addition to it. It could have been the other people who were interned in it, the other bodies, the children, those. It's not until you put probably the 60-year-old man that you want to signify that this is a person who has a little bit more honor, worth, someone, so his name gets carved on it, while the others did not. Because if he is the high priest, he ranks certainly above many other people in the first century. One other name. In Acts 18:12, we have a person by the name of Gallio, who was the proconsul, which is the same as being the governor of a province. And this is the province that was in Corinth, or where Corinth was the capital of the province. And he's mentioned specifically there in Acts 18, and we have an inscription with his name on it. So you can find these archaeological pieces of evidence that tangibly place people in the New Testament. But what about finding somebody who is an early Christian follower of Jesus? their name. One possibility. Erastus. In the ancient city of Corinth, when excavations were done there, and a great deal of excavation has been done in Corinth because there's not an ancient city or not a modern city on the top of it. The difference between Corinth and Thessalonica, Thessalonica today is a major city with a modern city over the top of it, so you can't excavate very well or very much. Corinth today is huge acreage with no modern cities around it, so you can excavate more of it. When excavations were done here, this paving stone came up. And this paving stone, the inscription is in Latin. You can see I put it there in bold in Latin for you, and I kind of highlighted it in red so you can see the letters. Those letters are carved out of the stone, and they would have had brass in them. So it would have been very shiny, very beautiful. But of course, as is typical in antiquity, if there's valuable metal there, it would have been pried out at some point and taken and melted and used for different purposes. But Erastus, and Erastus is mentioned in the New Testament in Romans. It says in Romans 16:23, Gaius, who is host to me, and the whole church greet you. Erastus, the city treasurer in Corinth, is that because this is where Paul is writing from, and our brother Quartus greet you. Well, this inscription here says Erastus, in return for his aliasship, laid the pavement at his own expense. So evidently he paid to have this. This is near the theater, what would have been near the theater there in Corinth, and he paid for the paving of it. This may be an early Christian follower of Jesus, and we have his name still preserved. So, interesting kinds of connections here with the New Testament. Significant. Significant, perhaps one of the most significant, the Dead Sea Scrolls. You just can't talk about archaeological discoveries in the ancient world and not mention the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are significant because they push our manuscript evidence of the biblical text, the Hebrew biblical text. They push it back from the year 1000. We had manuscripts from the year 1000 AD. This discovery pushes it back 1,000 years. So now we have the earliest Hebrew manuscripts available. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we have Hebrew scripture, we have their community rules, that is, how do you live in community together? What are the things that you do and don't do? For example, in the community there, you don't gesture with your left hand. You don't spit when you are in the midst of a worship service. You know, that's not a bad, it's not a bad rule wherever. And so there are other rules. Well, they had those. Then they had their songs and their hymns, and so they had their worship and liturgical writing. So there's really about 3 different styles of writing they had: scripture, the community rule, and then also their liturgical writings were discovered. When you hear Dead Sea Scrolls, it's a big grouping of objects or scrolls that were found. And of course, today, so significant, you can see that for some of you who have been here, we went to the Shrine of the Scroll, which you see on the right-hand side, and they have the symbolized scroll in the center, and you have preserved here in this Israeli museum the scrolls. Many of them, several of them were found in these clay jars. These are the longer ones, the more extensive ones that were found. But today, they're still discovering these. So there are new fragments coming up every day, but they are very small in nature. So here are some examples. And here's what they look like before they are conserved and preserved. How would you like to Some of you like to do jigsaw puzzles. You would love doing these jigsaw puzzles because look how they're putting this back together. And to find them, this is how they are finding them at this point. This is not for the faint of heart, getting into some of these caves. And you can see where they are sifting through, finding these extremely small, sometimes the size of a cornflake piece of manuscript that they try to put back together. So a great deal of manual labor that goes into this. So well-known discovery, Dead Sea Scrolls and manuscripts. Let me share with you another one that is not as well known, but I think is extremely significant for us. You don't hear much about it. The Oxymoronicus Papyri. Any of you heard about the Oxymoronicus? Aren't you glad you come? Because this is an extremely significant treasure trove of papyri. It was discovered in around the 1890, 1891, 92. There were several seasons of excavating by these two British scholars, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt. What they found in the desert of Egypt are manuscripts, fragments from the year 300 BC all the way to 640 AD. That's 1,000 years. And
Where was that found?
right here. Oh, great question. Great question. It's found in Egypt at this place called Oxymoronicus. And Oxymoronicus was a type of fish. So this is a town that originally was named after this fish that would be found here in this Nile River. So this is where they were discovered. These are some pictures from the discovery. They had hundreds of people working, digging and filling baskets up. It's a 1,000-year-old dump. And what had happened is they had taken these old documents, these writings, and had just thrown them out in the desert and collected more on top of them and more, and sand covered them over. They didn't, as would today here, perhaps when you have a lot of moisture, they didn't disintegrate. They might fragment, but they didn't disintegrate. But since the 1890s till today, only 1 to 2% have been conserved, translated, deciphered, and cataloged. Only 1 to 2% that have been discovered. There are 500,000 pieces of fragments of manuscripts that still have to be done. More than 2 or 3 lifetimes. Tons of this. So what did they discover? What kinds of manuscripts? Well, this is typical. Tyrus asked you to dinner for the offering to Our Lady Isis in the Isthmium on the 8th and the 9th hour. So this is very typical. 90% of what was discovered here are either public or private writings, and they are codes and edicts, their tax accounts, their sales, their court records. They are wills, they are bills, they are rent leases, they are inventories. Those are the kinds of things, everyday kinds of things that are discovered. That's 90%. 10%, however, are literary texts. Literary. Those, of course, these are interesting because they let you know how people lived, how much things cost, and the issues that people had in that day and age, which actually are some of the same issues we have today when you start looking at taxes and some of the things that people are doing. But there are some biblical texts that were found there. So this is from Matthew chapter 1. Now, this is all that was discovered. I mean, it wasn't the whole Bible. This is it. This is all there is. You can see how fragmentary it is, and you can see where it has holes in it. And they call these holes lacuna. So you kind of have to figure out what might have gone in there. Some of these fragments are this size. Some, as I mentioned, were smaller, small as a cornflake. Here's a very small fragment, but it's an interesting one. It's biblical also. This is from Revelation. Only the number of the beast in this manuscript, this would be what today we call Revelation 13:18. It's not 666, it's 616. So it tells you that there are manuscripts of Revelation out there that number the beast differently than we have in our biblical text today. So this is a very significant discovery that is continuing to yield things and will over the next many, many years. So you may hear some things about this, what has been discovered. Besides canonical gospels, such as Matthew or John and Mark, some fragments from them have been found, something from Romans and Galatians. In Revelation, there are also non-canonical gospels that were found. The Acts of Thomas, the Acts of Paul and Thecus, so things that didn't make it into the Bible were also discovered here in very fragmentary pieces. Well, from fragments to a whole Bible. If you had to find something, wouldn't you like to find a whole Bible? Not just a cornflake size of the Bible? This is the real Indiana Jones. This man was named Count von Tischendorf, lived from 1815 to 1874. He was a true manuscript hunter. And his greatest discovery was here at St. Catherine's Monastery. St. Catherine's Monastery still exists today. This is a recent picture of it. Is here in the Sinai Peninsula. When you are monks, you try to get away to the very most isolated place to purify yourself and be in touch with God. And here is St. Catherine's. When he was here, he discovered what is now called Codex Sinaiticus. This is the most complete Bible that was ever discovered, and it comes from the 4th century. So it is extremely old. Now, today, the British Library has 347 leaves of it. The University of Leipzig has 43. The National Library of Russia has 6, and St. Catherine's has 12. So you see how the Bible is divided up? Part of the reason is because when Count von Tischendorf came here to St. Catherine's Monastery, he made an arrangement where he could take it because he was going to bequeath it. Well, first of all, he found these 43 leaves and he took them back to Leipzig where he was staying, and he left them there. He came back a few years later and found a larger section of this Codex Sinaiticus, and that he negotiated where he could take it back because he said, if you let me take it back to Russia and take it back to the Tsar, you will receive X, Y, and Z because this is a Greek Orthodox monastery. So the whole Bible was actually in Russian. The greater part of it was there. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, they go, we don't need no Bible. So they said, let's sell it. And they sold it to the British Library. And in the 1930s, if you'd been living in England at this time, you would have been collecting pennies. The whole country did. they collected, well, not pennies, but pence and pounds. They collected those to get enough money to purchase it. So that's why you have it in the British Museum, most of it. That's why you have 6 leaves that accidentally got left behind in Russia. They actually found 12 more leaves later at St. Catherine's, and then Leipzig had their original 43. It's scattered everywhere, but this is what it looks like. 4 columns, extremely early, extremely good text of the biblical Bible that we have. This is what people draw upon greatly of the text that you are using today and translated into English. If you want to know more about it, there's a website called Codex Sinaiticus.
Maybe I missed it.
Yeah.
When was it written?
This was written in the 4th century. The 4th century. One of the earliest manuscripts that we actually have. We have some that might date to the 2nd and 3rd century, but they're just a leaf or 2. This is the largest. Yes, question?
Is there any kind of an effort to get the 4 pieces back together?
It's a great question. Is there an effort to get them back together? They've tried, but no one's going to let loose of what they have.
Yeah.
So how they've done it is digitally. This is the website that brings them all together back into one Bible. Whenever this website went live, a lot of us biblical nerds went crazy and we crashed it. People were so excited to see this. It is actually very fascinating. But as you can see here, the partner institutes are the British Library, the National Library of Russia, St. Catherine's Monastery, and Leipzig. They've all got them put together digitally.
What's its language?
It's Greek. Greek. This is this early Greek. In fact, here's a good example. I put it up here on the screen for you. When you go here, it will give you the Greek page. So you can see it off to the left. There's the Greek. It's beautifully written Greek. Notice it's all capital letters. Notice there's no punctuation. Greek did not use periods, commas, dashes, exclamation points, question marks. Didn't use any of those. Every question mark, every period, comma, all those are interpretations where we think they need to be long, because they did not use those. But these are all written here in capital Greek letters in 4 columns. It looks like, you can look at the handwriting, that there were actually 4 people who were involved in the writing process, with each having varying skills in the process. You can also see that there are hands of correctors who have come back and made some corrections. So you can do a lot of study here and figure out some things. But on the right-hand side, you can see where they have put the English translation. So you have the Greek on one side, but you also have the English, which is kind of nice there also. So you have the original, you have a transcription of it into Greek, and then you have the English translation. So it's a fun website just to explore a little bit. Yeah.
So the second one is that modern Greek, the first from that ancient Greek to modern Greek and then into English is.
Yes. Can you see my cursor moving? Can you see the cursor?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So this is, of course, this is the original writing here. Now, to make it easier to read, because this can be kind of tough, because you see there are no spaces. I don't know if I mentioned it, but they don't write with spaces. It's all written together. Just so where does it begin and where does it end? That makes it tough. So we go over here to the transcription, and they will put spaces in between, and they will use a modern Greek script, so it's easier to read. So now, and this is all written here from left to right, kind of like we read today. Not all Greek was written like that. There's a style of Greek where it's called, the technical Greek term slips me right now, but I know how it translates. It translates as the plowing cat. It goes like this, and then like this, and this like this. This is the way it's written. Yeah, it's the way. So manuscripts didn't necessarily have to follow a set form, but this is one of the loveliest and best. It is written not on papyrus, but it is written on vellum. So this is extremely thin animal skin.
You might mention how in the upper right, when somebody looked at a Greek New Testament, that at the bottom, there can be these notes that show you different manuscripts. I mean, it's not showing there, but you know what I'm saying?
Right. Today, for example, if you have a Greek New Testament, it may give you examples like down in the bottom where we might have footnotes, and it will say, even in some of your study Bibles, it will say some ancient manuscripts say, you see that? That's making reference to something like this. Other ancient manuscripts. This is one of the best, and really kind of the one of the foundations that people keep going back to. Well, those are some of the discoveries. There are many, many others in the biblical world. I mean, it's hard to kind of filter out what would be the most significant ones. But I do want to, in the time we have left, to talk about archaeology and looting. Looting is as old as, well, in 1 Samuel, the Philistines were fighting against the Israelites, and what did they do? They stole the Ark of the Covenant. So that's looting. And more looting. This is a scene that depicts what happens after the Jewish war in AD 70. If any of you have been to Rome, you may have had the opportunity to see the Arch of Titus. In the Arch of Titus are these reliefs that have been carved. And what you can see here are the Romans carrying away the loot from the temple. And you can see the menorah there in the right-hand side being carried away. So looting is an old habit. And it is certainly true for today. The illegal antiquities trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. As I mentioned last week briefly, after illegal drugs and arms sales, it's number 3. Hard to believe. They estimate somewhere between 3.4 billion and 6.3 billion are taken in these antiquity trade. The individual here on the left is someone who is with the Israeli Antiquities Authority. He's going through an inventory of a shop there in Jerusalem. If you have antiquities in Israel, then you can sell antiquities in Israel. There is a very strict policy about who can sell, and you have to keep inventories, and there's lots of checks, but you can do that. It's one way they're trying to combat looting a bit here. So, but it's huge. Well, why does it make a difference? Context. Context is so crucial for every single thing that is found archaeologically. The technical term for it is in situ. That is, here's a pot, and we know it was found here, and we know the context around it and the things found in it, but if somebody loots it, all it is a nice pot sitting on the shelf, but we don't know the story behind it or what it can tell us. So it is so important to find to locate it and document it where it was found. Instead, this is what happens. You see how random it is? People go out at night, they take shovels, picks, and dig and find what they can, and then put it on the market to sell. Because many of these people who are looting, some of them are quite poor, and it is a way to get some money for the family. However, there's another reason people loot. It's called blood antiquities. You've heard of blood diamonds? Antiquities are the same thing. Often these antiquities are used to fund terrorism activities. And so when people are buying them, realize this may be part of what is happening. Hobby Lobby. Well, this is, of course, what has happened with Hobby Lobby is that the founder of Hobby Lobby, Mr. Green, has founded the Museum of the Bible, MOTB. Sometimes it's abbreviated, Museum of the Bible. And in doing it, he has put millions and millions of dollars out there to buy antiquities to fill up his museum. So here's what happened. In 2010, there were shipments that were sent to 3 addresses in Oklahoma. These large shipments all had on the outside labels that they were clay tile samples. However, inside were 3,800 antiquities. These were clay tablets, these were seals, and a variety of other antiquities that were there. Plus, some of the other shipments had thousands also in them. Well, in 2010, these had to be given back to where they came from, which was Iraq. In 2021, took another 10 years or so, but they had to give back 8,000 antiquities to Iraq and 5,000 to Egypt. We add all that up, 16,000 artifacts had to be given back because they were purchased basically on the black market. They were looted and they were caught. This is just one of the highly publicized ones, but this goes on frequently. There is, yes, question?
The British Museum have to give back the Elgin marbles.
This is one of the ongoing issues that is being continually discussed today. The British Museum still has the Elgin marbles, which were the marbles that went around the top of Parthenon on the Acropolis. They still have them, but Athens wants them back. And so will they be repatriated back? It's a continuing question today. Yes?
David, wasn't there something just in the last month involving the British Museum and some well-known archaeologist or scholar had stolen from the British
Yes.
Museum and
Yes.
sold them to Hobby Lobby,
Yes.
and they've been traced, and now he's completely discredited.
He is discredited. He was at Oxford, and it was papyrus. These are the things that he pilfered. He had access to them, sold them, and again, they have had to go back and repatriate what they have. And yes, he has been disgraced. It's interesting, the individual, I believe his name is Dirk, D-I-R-K, oblique. And just an interesting kind of narrative aside, he bought a house in Waco, kind of a castle-like house. He never did really ever fix it up. Well, now Joanne and Chip purchased it from him, and they're in the process of fixing it up. So there is a little HGTV kind of. If you're in HGTV, it's kind of a little connection there. There are antiquity laws that have been on the book since the 1970s. And one of these laws is, and it's been adopted by the United States and a 127 other countries, cannot purchase a coin or an artifact that does not have a verifiable documentation that it was in a collection before 1970. So you can't buy anything unless it can be documented it was earlier than in a collection before 1970. Anything else would be considered illegal to own, to purchase. Now, doesn't mean that people don't doctor documents, because they do that. However, today what is happening, there is a lot of repatriation of stolen artifacts. More and more people are finding out, okay, here are issues, these have been stolen. This one was stolen World War I. Whenever a war breaks out, whenever there's chaos, archaeological looting takes place with antiquities. This is an early gospel manuscript, and it was stolen by Belgian soldiers from a monastery, and eventually it was repatriated back to its rightful place. But there is a question: should everything be repatriated? This is, I mentioned the earliest Hebrew scriptures we have come from the Dead Sea. But before that, this was the earliest. This is extremely early. It comes from the year about 1200. It is an early prayer book. The oldest Hebrew manuscript after the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here it is. The Museum of the Bible, the green, the Hobby Lobby, they paid $2.3 million for this. Well, the documentation claimed that it was in Great Britain in the 1950s, so it could be available. Actually, once they started doing research, they found out there were pictures of it that had been taken in the Afghanistan Museum in the 1990s, 1998. So it's very clear that it had been looted from Afghanistan. So, do we repatriate it to Afghanistan?
Or it will disappear again.
That's the question. That's the question. This is where it came from. Now, and here's the dilemma. The Museum of the Bible, they got it illegally. Here is, if we send it back, will it be destroyed? What do you do with an artifact like that? It's a great case study to try and say, how can we figure out what to do with something that does have this antiquity behind it? It's a significant artifact of civilization, of culture, of antiquity. What do we do? How do we come to some kind of resolution? Well, there's a lot of people I think there are a lot of people probably working on it. Let me suggest a couple of resources for you if you're interested in kind of following up on something like this. There is an archaeological study Bible, which makes perfect sense. You're looking at biblical text, or there are archaeological kinds of artifacts that help illuminate particular passages of Scripture. And this is one that's pretty good. It's one of the few I know that is out there. Then HarperCollins came out a few years ago with the visual guide to the New Testament. And I thought, well, this is brilliant too, because so often when we deal with guides to the Bible, it's always written text, but what about a visual? And this is an extremely well done, well documented artifacts that help you read some of the biblical text well. So I would suggest a couple of these resources for you if you're interested in following up. Questions that might have come to your mind in looking at these two things about discoveries and also the looting. I captured a lot of questions that you were asking along the way, but others that might come to your mind. Or anyone who is online on Zoom.
Well,
I have a question.
Yes.
It really pertains more to last week
Okay.
as well.
Sure.
You had a picture of a whole field of pottery shards.
Yeah.
It was just out there in the open.
Yeah.
Now, can anyone just come by and pick one of those up and take them with them?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
because that's a lot different than in the United States, the Southwest in particular,
Yeah.
where that's against the law to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not against the law, actually, to do it.
I picked them up.
In Israel, you pick them.
You can pick them up, but
And bring them home with you.
yeah. There was one time though, when I had one person who was picking up several, I kept thinking, man, there's enough there to make a whole big pie. And I thought, well, but you know, it's very much, it's everywhere, so ubiquitous. It's like picking up a rock. I've had groups that would go there and we would go to like where David picked up the 5 stones, and they'll pick up stones and pick stuff up, and people will ask me, say, all right, take these rocks. And I always tell them, hey, Israel is so full of rocks, they'll almost pay you to take rocks. Don't worry about taking rocks. Little pottery shards like that, no, it's not a big issue. I mean, they're thrown there, they have been used for what they were going to be used for. They're gone. Yeah. In many ways, it's kind of like saying, only many years beyond, I see a piece of a styrofoam cup from McDonald's laying on the ground. Would anybody care if I picked it up and I took it back to my country? Well, no. Go ahead, pick all the trash up you want out of our country. Because in some ways, these are the trash of the ancient world we've evaluated, and it's broken and it's not ever going to be used. They're not going to come back. So yeah, people pick it, and people pick up a shard here, a shard there to take back. There's nothing.
It said that you cited the United Nations statute that said that in order to sell something that's antiquity, it had to be shown that it was available in
Yes.
1970 or before.
Right.
So if I found a coin in Israel, I could not sell it.
No. You would have to turn that over to the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Yeah, exactly. Now, there'll be lots of people wanting to sell you coins in Israel, and 99.9% will be fake. So they love to sell fake coins, and they make them look even better than the real things. The fakes look sometimes better than the real, and that's because they do all kinds of creative things with them. I've heard of them even having kind of, putting them through goats. So, they kind of go through the system and they get kind of looking old and patina on them. So I've heard of all kinds of things to make them look more genuine, but 99.9% of the things you're going to buy, somebody comes up to you, hey, you want an ancient coin, it's going to be fake. If you do find something, you need to be able to turn it over to the Antiquities Authority. Now, Israel is one of the few countries, though, that you can buy them legally. They will let you buy them. Now, some of that is old inventory from the Israeli museums. You're excavating and you're turning up hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of oil lamps all the time. The museum's overflowing with their inventory. So, they may make a deal with antiquity dealers in the old city, and therefore you do have some selling of coins or antiquities there. But to get them out of the country, you need to have the stamp from the Israeli Antiquity Authority that, you can purchase this legally. So there are some things you have to do to take it out of the country. Well, let me end with this. What you see before you is a discovery that was made in Jerusalem. It was made just south of the old city and near the valley of Hinnom. And this is a Hebrew scriptural amulet. And when it was found on the right in the red, it was all wrapped up tightly. And what folks used to do is to have certain scriptures that they would carry around with them because they thought it would help them with safety and protection. And anything that was written was considered sacred, holy, protection. Writing was unique back here. And here is one of the earliest pieces of Hebrew scripture that we have. This Hebrew scripture goes even beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls. It mentioned the 9th century here. Look how far back it goes. And what it is a blessing that someone packed around for years. And here's the blessing. It's a good way for us to close. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. Good word for us.
Thanks, Dave.
Oh, thank you.